Yes, in the last session I was talking about how God gave me a wife working in the refugee camp. And what a gift she has been. And I just thought I would show a photo of her. That God, when we follow Him, seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. So if you're looking for a wife or a husband, you just might find that one out in the mission field someplace. So listen to God, and God will provide all your needs. Follow Him first. Seek Him first. So we came to Finland, and we got married, went back to the refugee camps, and we worked for 4.5 years there together. And we saw God do so many incredible things. And then my wife, she felt like God was saying to her that she was pregnant. And so we got all excited. Finally, we're going to have a baby, And so we got in our big house with all the other missionaries. We were given a little room for our baby, connected to our room. And so we got all these, in America we have these baby showers, they call them. So they give all these gifts for the baby. And my wife Hanali's pregnancy went very well. Everything was going well. And so we were so excited. And then I felt like God was saying that it's a boy, and his name shall be Paul. So Paul was a famous missionary in Cambodia who God used in a powerful way before Cambodia had fallen into communism. Signs and wonders were happening through his ministry. And I knew him in the refugee camps, and he was such a man of God. And so I wanted to name my first child after him. And so we were getting all excited, prepared for this baby, and then the time was coming that we had to go to Bangkok, because it was safer to go to a big hospital in Bangkok than to be in a refugee hospital on the border. So we went there, and my wife, she went into the to the place to have the baby, but she was laid on the table, and so she couldn't have a normal birth because the baby was too big or something. I don't know why, but then the placenta broke, and she started to bleed inside, and the baby, had to be immediately emergent surgery to get it out. And the baby was fine, put in an incubator, but Hanali, she was really in a very critical state. So they put her in a room in ICU to get back her vital signs and to try to put blood back into her, because she lost so much blood. And this was such a dramatic time in our lives that this happened. It all just because everything was going so well. And then she was wondering, why did God allow this to happen? So many times we're put in those situations, where these disasters happen, and we don't know why. We question God. Why would God, show us that we're going to have a baby, and then, something like this happens? But it happened in the Bible too. That the disciples went through many difficult times. Jesus said, "In this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." And God gives us peace even in the difficult times. And I just wanted to share a story about a refugee. We had a a leprosy hospital that Youth of the Mission ran in the camp. And the leader of that refugee hospital was a refugee himself who had leprosy, who had become a Christian, and we helped to disciple him. And he came to know God, and I was teaching him the Bible. And then he got married to another leprosy patient. And they had a beautiful wedding and a wonderful relationship. And then they had a baby, a son. And the son was about 2 years old. And then he died all of a sudden without any reason. And I'd been teaching these refugees how loving, how good God is, that He is kind, He's just, He's perfect, He promises that He will never leave us or forsake us. And then all of a sudden, their only son dies. And I just cried and cried. I couldn't believe that they had gone through so much suffering through the whole communist starvation time. And then they get leprosy in these communist camps. They get out to freedom in the refugee camp. They find each other and they have a baby, and then their only baby dies. And I thought, God, where are you? Why do you allow this to happen to this family who has suffered so much already? And then it was not long after that I went with them outside of the refugee camp and helped them to bury their son, their only son. And I just could not, I didn't have anything to say. All I could do is cry. And it wasn't long after that his wife died. And I just couldn't believe it. God, where are you? Why do you allow this to happen? I was so disappointed with God. And then I went out with him outside of the camp and buried his wife next to his son and just wept with him. I couldn't comfort him. I couldn't say, what could I say? All he had was gone. His wife, his child, and then he had this leprosy disease that it's, because we gave them the right medicine and stuff in the leprosy hospital, the disease did not spread. But still, their faces showed that they had that disease. So it's very difficult for people to relate to them. And then I'm with my wife in the hospital in Bangkok, and my wife is in critical condition. And I went in there to comfort her and just to pray for her. And then, all the time we had been praying, Lord, help us to understand the suffering of these refugees. That many of them, they had, many brothers and sisters, but they were the only one that survived. Or they saw their mother and father killed or starved to death. And they had all these traumatic stories, but I never saw anybody die in my family. I never experienced that kind of pain and suffering. And so, but I asked God, help me to understand the suffering of these refugees. You can imagine about 2 million of these Cambodian people starved to death or were murdered. And many of the family members see this happen in a 4-year period. And then when I was with my wife, I tried to comfort and pray for her, and I would go out and spend time with my son that I named Paul, the Cambodian name. And then I called all my family members and said, we have a beautiful son, and his name is Paul, and he's healthy, but pray for Hanale because she is in critical condition. And then after 3 days, all of a sudden, my son died. And I just could not understand, because the doctor says he was fine. The nurses said he's okay. And I was holding his little hand. And like before he died, he squeezed my finger. And I just couldn't believe that he actually disappeared. You know, and that God would promise us a son and then take him away. And it was heartbreaking. And so I had to go tell my wife, who was in critical condition, that our son just died after 3 days. And then she said to me, her fever was going up, and she was saying to me that, you know, we've been praying that we can identify with the suffering of these refugees who have seen so many of their family members die. And she said, maybe God wants me to really understand, just like this one refugee who was the leader of the leprosy ward in the camp, saw his only son die, and his wife die. And Hanale said that maybe God wants me to also suffer the same thing so that I can understand their suffering. And I just started to panic and fear as I saw the temperature of my wife going up, and that she had lost so much blood and she was in such critical condition. I was in panic, and God, no, don't let it happen, you know, and I was just freaking out. And then all of a sudden my wife starts to sing and praise God. And it was like the room was full of the presence of God, just the peace, like I felt that first time, the peace of God that surpasses all understanding. In the midst of darkness and gloom and hopelessness, all of a sudden this supernatural peace comes over us. And I knew that God was with us. And I started to praise God and sing with my wife. And the peace was just so present. And her fever went down, and she quickly, you know, got better. And then I started to think, maybe God wants to raise our son from the dead. And our son was being kept in a room underneath the hospital. So I would go down there and I'd pray for our son to rise from the dead. You know, I was kind of making a deal with God. I said, God, if he rises from the dead, everybody in the hospital will believe in you, because he was dead for 3 days. And if he rises from the dead after being full of all kinds of chemicals and stuff, everybody's going to know. Everybody in the refugee camp is going to hear that God raises people from the dead today, just like he did 2,000 years ago. God, do it. So all of a sudden, this faith started to spring up in our hearts to believe that God can raise the dead. And so we prayed, and then finally the day came where we had to take our son to the graveyard and bury him. But all along, I was saying, okay, God, when all these people, all the refugee missionaries, workers coming there, I think there was about 100 of them, all of a sudden they will see our son come alive, just like it happened in the Bible, and they will believe. Their faith will be strengthened to know, God, that you can do anything. Nothing is too difficult for you. And but the sad thing is that we had to bury our son in the ground in Thailand, and he's still there today. And it was so painful, especially for my wife, because, you know, here we had all these baby clothes and all the baby room prepared, and it was like a dream destroyed, you know. And for me, it took a few months to really understand what was happening. But for Hanale, it took about 7 years. She still has pain when she remembers our son buried in Thailand. And when it comes Christmas time and holidays, when you go and visit your relatives who have died and put candles there, she gets so sad around Christmas time because she can't go to Thailand and put a candle at the grave of our son, our first son, our beloved son. And I found out later that the Cambodian name Sopal actually means the seed that fell into the ground and brought forth much fruit. I didn't know that when I was told the name for my son. And but then years later, see, God always turns everything around for good. Oh, and just to say that this one refugee from the leprosy camp, when he heard that our baby died, he sent me a letter, or us a letter to the hospital where we were. And he said that God is good, God is loving, and God will turn this around for good. Can you imagine that? His wife and his child are buried outside of the refugee camp. But he received comfort from the Holy Spirit, to comfort us in our time of grieving and pain. And then he was accepted to go to New Zealand as a refugee. And later on, he wrote a book. And he said that he believes today because in that time when his wife and his son were buried outside of the refugee camp, he said that I was there weeping with him the whole time. And he said because of that, he believed. He didn't give up hope. And God was using him now in New Zealand in a powerful way. And he wrote a book about his story, his life, and how God turns all things around for good for those who love him. What a testimony of God's comfort and his love and how he does what he promises to do. He's the God of all comfort who comforts us, the Father of mercy, the God of all comfort who comforts us in all our pain and affliction so that we can comfort others with the same comfort that God comforts us. That's what God does. So every pain, every sorrow, every death, every bad, evil thing that we go through, if we allow God to comfort us, he will use us to comfort others with the same comfort that he comforted us. That is just one story of many. But that's not the end. God gave us Samuel. Samuel was our second son. And here's a photo of him in the refugee camp, surrounded by Cambodian children. Samuel in the Bible is a gift from God. And he was such a gift from God for us. And so God gave us two kids, actually. We have Paula too. Paula was a gift from God too. And then it came about that my wife became very sick. Samuel was 2 years old and our daughter Paula was 6 months. And my wife started to have heart problems. Her heart was going crazy. And so we went to the heart hospital, heart institution in Bangkok to find out what was wrong with her heart. And she had all these tests and scans done, and her heart was doing all these crazy beats and arrhythmias that the doctors could not understand. And they tried everything for 3 weeks. They were testing her for everything. And they said that the only way to really find out and to fix her heart is to do surgery. And so our leader in Thailand said that we need to go back to Finland to have that open heart surgery, or that surgery done for her. So we got on an airplane with a Norwegian doctor and a Swedish nurse on a Finnish airplane. And we were taken back here to Finland to find out what's wrong with her. And my wife is from Joensuu, so we went to Joensuu, which they have very qualified, good heart surgeons there. They actually, in Karelia, that area of Finland, has the most heart diseases than anywhere else in the world, I found out. So they're very professional there. And so they did all these tests on her heart there, and they found out that her heart structure is okay. But they couldn't figure out why her heart was going crazy and doing all these extra beats. And she went to every doctor and that she can. For 7 years, she was struggling with this heart problems, and then finally it ended up where God showed her clearly through a magazine. She looked at a magazine that had this doctor's name, who deals with these amoebic dysentery and tropical diseases, and so she felt like God said that she needs to go to that doctor. And so she looked it up and found out that doctor actually is in Helsinki, not in Europe or someplace. So she went there, and that was the start of the beginning of the healing, that she had this amoebic dysentery that had destroyed her intestines, that was affecting her heart. But anyway, that's another story of her healing after 7 years. But we came back to Finland in 1991, and I was just crying out to God, heal my wife so I can go back to the Cambodian people. He only called me, the only vision I ever had was the Cambodian people. And he said to go tell these people about you. And so I was there for 10 years. But I wanted to go back. I wanted to go with these refugees back to Cambodia. I spoke the language. I loved the people. I had a ministry, 13 different churches. I was discipling the pastors. And I didn't want to stop. I wanted to continue to obey God with the mission that he had sent me to. But then I was asked by some of the old leaders of lähetykseen if I would come and help restart Youth in the Mission in Finland. And I said, no, thank you. I said, there's only one place I want to be, and that's with these Cambodian people that God called me to. And then I cried out to God over and over again. I learned how to cross-country ski, and I was skiing on the lake close to Joensuu, the Holy Back Lake, it's called in English, Buha Selka. And I learned how to ski, and I would cry out to God in the middle of this lake in the wintertime. And I said, send me back to the people you called me to. And then I heard this still small voice speaking to me. It wasn't a loud voice, but it was something deep in my spirit, my heart, that God said, I'm not to go back to those people. That it wasn't the devil. I thought the devil brought me to Finland, but it was him who brought me here. And he said, I want you to reach the Finnish people. And then I started to open up and think, and I repented. I said, God, okay, not my will be done, but your will be done. And in 1991, Russia and the Soviet Union was still closed to the gospel. And I started to look and pray on the Russian border there in Joensuu. I started to pray for Russia and the Soviet Union, that God would open the doors so that missionaries, because it was very difficult back then to go to Russia or Soviet Union with the gospel. But I said, open the doors so that your word can go through Russia and Soviet Union so that we can disciple and transform. Reformation can come to Russia and the Soviet Union. And then I said, God, send me. I thought, oh no, what did I say? You know, not my will, but let your will be done. But it was shortly after that Youth with Mission started works all over Russia. In St. Petersburg, we started the first DTS. And I spoke in 5 of the first 6 discipleship training schools in Russia. They started a street kids home. Yari and Tanya Koivu started a street kids home there, and I would go there, and some of these street kids got saved. And then they started to come to the DTS, which I was teaching in. And then they started to come to Finland, and we were discipling some of them here in Finland. And the story goes on that God was using our mission because we prayed. We said, God, nothing, no one, nothing is, no doors are closed for you. And he made a way. So God bless you. Hello, friends. I want to talk to you about revival. I want you to know that revival is coming to Finland. And actually, it's already started. And that's what I'll be teaching about, is the little signs of revival that I've seen in the north, south, east, and west of Finland as I've been praying for every city and town in Finland and seeing what God is doing. God wants you to know. And this generation is a visual generation. And the young people, they want to see God moving. They don't want to just hear about it, what's happening in Africa or someplace else. They want to actually see it with their own eyes. And TV7 is going to bring this news to you that you can share, and that these young people can start to see that God is moving in a powerful way, even in Finland. And if you would like to support this ministry and get this visual generation, the messages that they can actually see what God is doing, and get them understanding that God is moving right now, not just someplace in the future, then they will get excited and they will want to come and listen and come to know this Jesus that is moving around them. That young people are coming to Christ more than ever before in this nation. And we need to believe that this is the generation that is seeking after God. So they will show you how you can support this ministry of TV7. God bless you.